and trying to make sure that our voices are heard. There's a lot of people that turn in ballots that they're not being counted and they're just being disregarded, and I feel like that's unfair.
You get kind of fired up about it because you really want, if you're really interested in politics and democracy, you want the system to work. And it's clear that it just didn't work correctly.
I don't find it hard to believe that there are neighborhoods in the United States where President Obama got 97 to 99% of the vote. But the turnout level strikes me as possibly suspicious. And Philadelphia has been a place that's had some pretty irregular election procedures in the past.
We had a lot of people come out on Election Day, so that's great. What I want to do now is sit down with the Secretary of State and say, how can we improve this?
With its sometimes scary, sometimes shaky claims of voter fraud, its lawsuits over voter ID, and its 6 and 7 and 8 hour long waiting lines, this, folks, was an ugly, contentious election. One of the rising stars of the Republican Party, our pal Kris Kobach, is the Kansas Secretary of State. He pushed through a tough photo ID requirement in his state. We're going to talk to Kris about it. Niger Innis, the national spokesman for the Congress of Racial Equality, believes that efforts to crack down on voter fraud are actually aimed at cutting down votes. So, Niger, welcome to you. Secretary Kobach, welcome to you. Ms. Secretary, you first. Is this problem really one of a certain magnitude, or really is it a solution chasing a problem?
Well, there's no question we have voter fraud, pockets of it all over the country. In Kansas even, where you wouldn't necessarily think of there being a long history of voter fraud, we had 235 cases that we'd identified before we put this photo ID law in place. And in this last election, the photo ID law, which, as you mentioned, is one of the toughest in the country, worked very well. We had 1.2 million people cast ballots. Of those, only 838 forgot to bring a photo ID or didn't bring a photo ID to the polls. That's fewer than 1 in 1,000 voters, and they were all given provisional ballots. About a third of them did come in during the week after the election, got to make their vote count. And to date, we haven't found anyone. We're doing research on the 838 voters who actually didn't have a photo ID. So the bottom line is it's a common sense, easy way to prevent some forms of voter fraud. And it is, in fact, a problem that exists. Voter fraud is very real in America.
Since you said 235 claims of voter fraud, since when and who's making these allegations?
Actually, 235 verified cases, that had been reported, and it was during the period between 1997 and 2010.
And so you had reported to whom, by whom? How do we know? Are they real? Are you sure of that?
Yeah, well, and these were reported to the county clerks, and the cases that couldn't be, were not credible, were not included. So credible reports of voter fraud to the county clerks or to the Secretary of State's office, my predecessor in my office. And the bottom line, Geraldo, is, people sometimes approach it this way. They say, well, how many cases of voter fraud is enough to worry about? I'd say, look, as long as there's any voter fraud of any significance, that means that a close election can get tipped one way or the other. We had a couple of state legislative races this year where fewer than 10 votes decided the winner or the loser. There was one that was an exact tie, and and it had to be decided by a coin toss. And when it's that close, the slightest amount of voter fraud can steal the election. And I think most Americans want to know, hey, look, if it's close, we want to be sure that every vote was fairly cast. And that's what the Kansas law does, and some of the other states are moving in the same direction.
So, Niger Innis of Congress of Racial Equality, what's wrong with what Secretary Kobach just suggests? We only want legit voters to vote, right?
Well, actually, I'm going to surprise you. I actually agree. And I think that first of all, hello to you and to Kris. I think what Kris is doing, I think it's called the SAFE Act in Kansas, is a good thing. One principal reason is because for those individuals that find it difficult because of economic circumstances or because of geography, I believe the Kansas law, the Kansas state law, and various other state laws address that and deal with that. I think individuals that can get a voter identification and have an economic challenge to do so, and the state has the moral, then the state has the moral obligation to provide them with that ID. But once that is done, I've got no issues with promoting voter integrity, including voter identification.
So when we heard just now Michael Barone in that clip we showed suggesting that in Philadelphia, for instance, when you had 97, 99% of certain precincts, black precincts, Niger, voting for the president, he smelled a rat. I mean, was there a rat, or was there an overwhelming mandate for the president?
No, I think there was an overwhelming mandate for the president. I think those who charge voter fraud have the obligation to not just throw out anecdotal information. They have the obligation to prove it. That doesn't mean that photo IDs are not necessary. I believe they are. That efforts to use technology and common sense laws to promote voter integrity are necessary. They are. But the fact is, I blame more the stupidity of the Republican Party for writing off the black vote, writing off the Latino vote for these high turnout numbers and overwhelming numbers for President Obama, not because of fraud that may have taken place. It was much more because the Republican Party completely, in this election cycle, completely wrote off these communities of color.
Secretary Kobach, can you help me out here? You got 30 seconds. My mom's 93 years old. She's proud of voting. She doesn't drive anymore. She has no photo ID. What's she going to do?
Well, a couple of things. One is, in Kansas, if you're 65 or older, you can use an expired photo ID. So she can use that driver's license from the 1960s if she's got it. Another thing is that if she's permanently disabled, we do have a special category for disabled voters who can't get to a state office to get a free photo ID. And Niger is right. We do provide a free photo ID to anyone who signs a piece of paper that says, I don't have one of these 9 pieces of ID. So there is no economic impediment, and it just ensures people that no one else is taking their vote. And that does happen, and it happens throughout this country, where people will fraudulently claim to be someone else, or they'll claim to be a multiplicity of people to cast multiple votes.
Got to leave it there. Secretary Kobach, thank you. Niger, thank you. Regards to Roy, your dad, a historic figure. Up next, you'll hear from the Donald on whether he has any regrets regarding the election. We'll be right back.